Good morning, guys. It is Mrs. Donahue and Killian, continuing to come to you from my surgical recovery bed. I am going to be going over the questions in the exit tickets that I received as of this morning. So if you still haven't put that exit ticket in, your question won't be addressed in this video. But I thought that would be the most straightforward way to sort of go down the line and look at them. It seemed like many of you enjoyed the PowerPoint, which made me so happy. You know how I am. I'm a huge nerd for my own PowerPoints. So, questions you still have about the plays. Why was Richard so horrible as a king? You would think that all of his advisors and how long he had been on the throne, he would have been a good king. I mean, you would, right? You would kind of trust that people in power who have been in power for a while learn something, but the unfortunate truth about humanity is you can't teach some people. And Richard's one of those people. He's very firmly set in his ways. And he was actually at a detriment being on the throne so long. He almost took for granted that it would always look this way. So it's just an example of someone who had no perspective, really would not have been great in a kingship position. He would have been a great prince. Like if he was like Prince Charles now, where Prince Charles has been prince for like 70 odd years. I mean, Richard would have been gravy boating that. He would have been amazing, but it's just he was king. Was Queen Elizabeth, I'm assuming the first, ever married? No. There are some scandalous and salacious rumors that she perhaps was not in fact a virgin queen, but no, she never married. She intentionally played around with marriage. She intentionally offered marriage to people and then rescinded the offers. My favorite one was she offered to marry the Princess of Spain rather than the prince because the princess, she said, had more merit as a husband. She would burn these people so badly. It was great. She knew that whoever she married, so the dynamic of the time in terms of gender was wives are subservient to husbands. But she was meant to be the ruler of the country. There was going to be an oddity to her marrying because technically that person should have had sway or say over her. And she understood that she'd be surrendering sort of the greatest power of her time. So she just kind of chose not to. How many different versions of I assume the play are there, and why are there different ones? So as many as there are play companies who do the play. It's up to interpretation a lot of times, how you adapt these words. As I said, Shakespeare doesn't give us much in the way of concrete, do it this way. Richard is always going to be a 20 to 25-year-old young male with a small beard that's cropped to here and long hair and a high-pitched voice. Like, we don't get any of that. So the thing is, you could have Richard II, and because it's a history, we tend to see them based in historical time, but you could totally adapt this and make Richard II based in modern times. You could do a racially swapped Richard II. You could do, for the most part, a gender swap if you swapped everyone evenly. How is it possible to be a 10-year-old king? Them's the kicks when you have divine rights monarchy going through family lines. So it was just Richard's lot in life. His father died when he was 10. Therefore, the divine bloodline rests in a 10-year-old. Now, when he was 10, there were likely many regents or advisors who were doing some of the, like, you obviously can't ask a 10-year-old what their opinion on taxation is. They don't even know what it is. But you would let him make as many decisions as he could, and then people who were sort of in charge of different areas would continue being in charge of it. Richard's not 10. This was a question I saw a couple times during our play. Richard died in his early 30s, so he's been on the throne for about 20 years by the time you see him. He's had plenty of time to be bad at being a king. It was important to me to tell you that he was crowned as a child, and that a lot of his early bad decisions sort of set him up poorly because he never does anything to make them better. Killian is riveted by this conversation, by the way. Why did Richard exile Mowbray if it was his idea, I assume, to kill Gloucester? To keep up face. So a king can't be seen like some cartoonish Queen of Hearts and Alice in Wonderland off with his head. Most kings didn't publicly execute their private squabbles. Like if I was squabbling with someone and I'm the king, I don't just go like having them openly killed, because I mean, that's going to make people real uncomfortable real fast. But Mowbray, I don't know, was listening to Richard, but Richard never directly said anywhere to do it. So then if someone says to Richard, Mowbray killed your other person, Richard can't just be like, eh. It implicates Richard if he doesn't punish Mowbray in some fashion. And he almost punishes Mowbray. Like that's why Mowbray gets the permanent exile. He almost over punishes Mowbray to protect his own reputation. Even though, like I said, a lot of people figured it out. How come Henry is next in line for the throne rather than anyone else, such as an uncle or another cousin? So, say you have 3 brothers. Until they have children, they are each other's line of succession. Like if you think of William and Harry. William, as far as I'm concerned, is next in line. Charles is not going to ascend to the throne of England. He'd be a fool to. Anyway, William first in line, Harry was second in line. When William's son was born, because William is the number 1, everything goes down the number 1 chain until it goes over to Harry. So you have to go down all the descendants of William before you move over to Harry. Same thing with Edward the Black Prince. So now that Edward the Black Prince is king, you have to go through all of his children, which is Richard, until you move over the line. Now, John of Gaunt, the younger brother, was extremely ill at the time. So it may be that there's a technicality there where you're looking at John of Gaunt going, he doesn't have long. And you're just kind of mentally skipping over to Henry Bolingbroke because he is younger, stronger, more popular. There might have even been an idea that John of Gaunt would have abdicated, would have handed over the crown to his son because he didn't want to rule, and his son would have been a better choice. If they are looking at Henry Bolingbroke, we should look at Henry Bolingbroke. But good catch on the idea that John of Gaunt felt a little skipped over there, whoever's question that was. If Richard has a wife at age 10, yes, he was about 10 or 11 when he got married. Good catch there. Then how was he gay? Well, we don't know that he was gay. The way Shakespeare writes Richard, he certainly comes off as a little queered, at least to modern readers. They had a totally different understanding of sexuality in Shakespeare's own time. So what we would look at and go, gay? Shakespeare's time wouldn't have necessarily had the same reaction. There was the idea that Richard was far too emotionally invested with his friends rather than his wife. And also, just because Richard is married doesn't mean that he's having sex with his wife. They were both prepubescent children when they got married. She lived in France pretty much the entire time and never came to England. And I mean, that's a thing too. Like some men who are hiding their sexuality have straight relationships. In the play you read, Richard's wife is an adult, but she makes several commentaries about, I wish you would come back to me. I wish you would in so many ways, I wish you would come back to our private life. Like you're never with me. You're always with your friends. I wish you would treat me like you treat your friends. And there seem to be these entreaties about how much private time he spends with his friends instead of her. And that's what make us kind of go, why? Now, in Shakespeare's way of understanding it, it might not have been a commentary on gayness, because again, totally different set of rules then. What you guys might consider a much more liberal set of rules. But Shakespeare is kind of indicating he doesn't know how to be a husband. He doesn't know how to be a man. He doesn't know how to be a king. He doesn't know how to do any of these things properly. And again, to reiterate, one of the questions was, is Richard 10 during the play? No, he's in his early 30s. Kind of a little fuzzy on how old precisely he was when he died, but early 30s, we're going to say, somewhere between 32 and 34. What events aren't historically accurate from Richard II? The fact that his wife was that old and living with him, not accurate. The actual characters of Bushy and Green are not real people, but they're based off of real people. Bless you. The ages between Richard and Mowbray are slightly off. So, Richard and Henry Bolingbroke. So, you don't see it in the Richard 2 that I would have shown you, but you did read it. You saw Henry Bolingbroke's son, Harry. And that's Henry V. And Henry V is old enough that he met Richard. So the guy who's going to take over France in not that long from now, he is, I think, an early teen right now. So Bolingbroke's old enough to have teenage children. He's older than Richard. It's part of the appeal, actually, to a lot of people that Richard's been a kid this whole time and he doesn't seem to be getting any more mature. He doesn't seem to be growing up. And Bolingbroke is. He's a good husband. He's a good father. He's a man's man. So they tend to, at least when we're reading it, we tend to age Bolingbroke down to the same age as Richard, and they tend to do that in a lot of movie productions of it as well. Also, while there were the Irish wars going on with Richard, Shakespeare sort of manipulates these to his advantage. Richard, his throne was taken right from underneath him. There was very little resistance. And then, like I said, his death is a big question mark in history where we don't quite know exactly how he died. Very suspicious. Why wasn't Richard raised more like his father? Oh, I'm sure Edward the Black Prince was having him raised in Edward the Black Prince fashion. Just because you raise your kid a certain way doesn't mean it doesn't mean it works. I want you to imagine, like, vintage, gigantic Terminator style Arnold Schwarzenegger, but having, like, this string bean kid who just can't lift the barest weight. It doesn't matter what Edward the Black Prince wants from his son. His son is what he is. His son's sort of a skinny, boring dice player. And, he was this soldier. And there's another question about if his father, was a certain way, how come Richard ends up being so different from his own family and his own father? Later on, when you see Prince Henry V, Prince Hal, when he's like drinking and carousing and not being a very good prince, there's a lot of comparisons made to him and Richard by Henry Bolingbroke, who's the king at the time. And he says, like, do you want to be like Richard where no one respects you? It seems like there's always a line in families where there's some similarities between different people. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm a lot more similar to my aunt than I am to my mother. So there's no guarantee that it falls necessarily cleanly in family lines. In that way, I really like how Shakespeare portrays it. Shakespeare has this way of being very human, very real in how he writes, that we don't often attribute to older style writing. So that's just something that I find very organic, very real. Why did Richard II become king and the throne skipped a whole generation? I assume this refers to the uncle. So I explained that earlier. Once Edward the Black Prince is king, you got to go through all his people before you skip over to the other side. And once Richard is king, he can also say, I'm going to name my uncle my heir, like kind of it should be, or I'm going to name a different heir. Once someone is king, they can decide who the throne goes to. So Richard named Bolingbroke, which was pretty much everyone's choice. John of Gaunt was older and not in great health. So everyone was kind of eyeing Henry Bolingbroke anyway. And like I said, after he exiles Henry Bolingbroke, he goes around and says, my cousin on the other side, Mortimer. We're naming Mortimer heir now. So Richard has every right to do that. If no one liked Richard, would it have been possible to remove him from the throne quicker? I mean, by all accounts, we had a pretty fast throne removal with Richard. I know 20 years doesn't seem like a lot, but by the time he had really angered everybody, it was 5-ish years or so from like tensions really pretty high to like Richard being off the throne. You don't see a lot of people wholeheartedly removing kings from within their own systems. Sure, they kill each other's kings all the time if they can help it, or they try to marry into each other's thrones. But like, you really introduce great instability into your own system by killing your king. So, I mean, that's how unlike Richard was. Was Shakespeare a feminist? Oh my. No, because there wasn't a thing of feminism when Shakespeare is writing, and I think it's poor practice to misattribute things to different time periods. Shakespeare had a totally different understanding of gender. For his own time, though, he is fairly intelligent and fairly imaginative. He's able to really look at core issues. He is a better writer in that way than other people that he writes next to. If you put him next to Christopher Marlowe, who is his number one competitor, every day of the week, Shakespeare's plays have more complex characters. They deal more with what it means to be a person, and in how we would read it, how like gender and society play into that question. Was Shakespeare a feminist? Meh. Cheated on his wife rampantly. Married her when she was pregnant. Her name was Anne Hathaway. One of my favorite facts of history. Shakespeare's wife was named Anne Hathaway. He had 3 children with her, one set of twins and an older daughter. So when he died, he left everything not to his daughter, but to the male heirs of her body. And his daughters had daughters, and the Shakespeare line died out about 2 generations later, so there's no living descendants of Shakespeare. He had one son, Hamnet, with an N, who died the same year as Shakespeare's father, or very close to his father. And it was a dark, dark year for Shakespeare. And the tragedy of Hamlet, with an L, comes out shortly thereafter. So, oh no. Mackenzie entered the room. Why didn't Richard listen to the Duke of York despite being warned about the repercussions of taking John of Gaunt's property and money? Remember the loaded dice story. Richard thinks that there are no consequences for his actions, even when people sort of warn him that there are. Even when people say, Mackenzie's helping me, even when people say this is a bad idea, Richard's like, well, I am the king and God appointed me king, and therefore I will do whatever I want. Right, Mackenzie? Right. Exactly. Why was Richard such an atypical king? Usually kings with divine power are very menacing and violent. I think you, clever student, are referring to Machiavelli. It is better to be feared than loved, which actually comes after Richard and comes in the Italian kings. A lot of the kings from this time, in fact, no closing it up. In terms of kings, pretty much from Beowulf, which is, 700 AD or whatever, all the way up through Queen Victoria, you will hear divine rights kingship. Mackenzie, I'm working. Please leave.
Please close it up.
You are going to see divine rights kingship straight through 1900, when Queen Victoria is reigning. So they're not all menacing and violent. They do tend to take 2 different sides of the argument, like God placed me here, I am going to be like the loving outstretched arm of God, or God placed me here, all ye, enter and beware. So Richard was just of the impression that he could do whatever he wanted, and he was more interested in entertaining himself. I mean, makes him bad at what he does. For Macbeth, I love Macbeth questions. If the witches prophesied that Banquo's children will be kings and Fleance escape murder, why did Fleance not become king instead of Malcolm? So, did you notice that we have no heirs under Malcolm? So Fleance is his heir. Why is it that power always corrupts? Why do none of the kings use it responsibly? I mean, I wouldn't say none. You do mention this. The student also mentions Duncan and Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke is a better king, but he's a nervous king. And he's a nervous king because he knows that he has kind of established that it's okay to kill kings we don't agree with. Power is, I don't know, think of it as a seductive force. You don't tend to see how much damage it's doing until the damage is done, until you're in the aftermath and you're like, what have I gotten myself?
Mommy just hurt me.
Mackenzie, I'm on the computer for school. Please leave.
I will not.
If Bolingbroke really had Richard killed, or if he just died of unfortunate
Wait, they're
circumstances.
going.